Hello, everyone, and welcome to this October Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition webinar. Today, the topic of our webinar is the state of youth confinement and lessons for all of us. And the reason for this is that, as all of you know, whether you're working in juvenile detention or working with adults, we often find that we're separated, we're siloed, and we're not aware of what the others are doing. So this webinar seeks to bridge both our realities of both juvenile work and working with adults through Prison Policy Initiative's new report, Youth Confinement, The Whole Pie 2025. And it connects the state of juvenile corrections with broader issues for all of us involved in the United States criminal justice system. And we hope that ministers across the spectrum of youth and adult ministries will find this helpful. I am the Catholic chaplain at San Quentin Rehabilitation Center in California. I'm also on the board of Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition, and I'm happy to welcome our guests today. But before we do that, I'd like to start with a prayer. So let's take a moment and just a moment of silence. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, we pray for all those who are caught up in our criminal justice system, especially juveniles. We pray for those who minister to them, for those who work in these institutions. We pray for the family members of all of them, and we pray for the victims of their crimes. We ask you, Lord, to help us to find ways to humanely serve those who are incarcerated and to find ways to reduce the numbers of people who find themselves incarcerated in our country. We ask your blessing upon our time together today. In Jesus' name, amen. So I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Wendy Sawyer. Wendy is the research director of the Prison Policy Initiative, a national organization that conducts research to expose the forms of mass incarceration and fuel advocacy campaigns for change. Along with directing the organization's research priorities, she's the author or co-author of many PPI reports, including Mass Incarceration, The Whole Pie, which gives a big picture perspective of mass incarceration in the United States, as well as she reports on the bail bond industry, youth confinement, the misuse of police and jails to respond to social problems, and gender and racial disparities in incarceration. Happy to note that she is a fellow graduate of Northeastern University's College of Criminal Justice. And so it's great to have you with us, Wendy. Those of you joining us today live, if you have any questions or comments, please write them in your chat feature, and I will direct them to Wendy after she finishes her presentation. So good morning, Wendy.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here. Yeah, and that was a very nice introduction and bio, but I would also just say that I also do have some personal experience with family members who have been involved in the juvenile system. So if anyone is interested in any of my perspectives from that front, I'm happy to talk about that later too. But for the most part, I think we're just going to be talking about this report we recently put out and just trying to give you sort of an introduction to the juvenile side of things. Because as I understand it, most folks in this network are working with adults and in adult facilities. So, all right, without further ado, I just want to start by giving you a sense of the scale of the juvenile justice system and some of the top line numbers that we have about youth confinement. On any given day, we're talking about 32,000 youth who are held in facilities away from home. So that's a much, much smaller number compared to the adult system, which has about 2 million people who are locked up on a given day. The number of confined youth used to be much, much greater. That's part of the story that we're going to tell today. There were over 120,000 youth locked up just 25 years ago on a given day. And just to be really clear about who we're talking about youth who are up to about age 17 in most states. Age 18 is the most common age of criminal responsibility. So that's the point at which you would be tried in an adult court versus the juvenile court. And at the low end, kids as young as 6 can be referred to the juvenile system. That's in North Carolina, I think, where they have that floor. But there's a lot of states that have no floor at all. So we don't really know what the youngest children in the system are. They all kind of get lumped together in the data as under 12. But we're talking about some very young children all the way up to young adults. In terms of the ceiling, so when we're talking about youth who are in these facilities, oh, I see Kara's working on the slides, thanks. When we're talking about who's in these facilities, they can be up to in the early 20s, because once your case is handled in the juvenile system, you tend to stay in that system through, usually it's around like 20 or 21. So we do see some older youth in those same facilities, but the courts themselves cases are typically working with younger kids. All right. Part of the reason for this separation is we have some legislation. So there's the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act and the Prison Rape Elimination Act that require sight and sound separation from adults. So you can't house youth with adults. So that's part of the reason for this separation. So I know we just said it's about 32, thank you. It's about 32,000 youth who are confined on a given day, but over the course of a year, it's many, many, many more children. We're talking about more than 500,000 juvenile cases referred to courts by police or school officials, parents, community members. All of these folks can refer kids to the courts. Typically it is police, it's through arrest, but referrals come from schools too, and from anyone who really identifies a problem. Out of home placement, which is what we're going to call, so confinement is not typically called incarceration. Yes, that's right. In the juvenile system, they'll call it residential placement or commitment to placement. So that's relatively rare as an outcome these days. More typically, cases are dismissed or they end up in probation, but about 1 in 8 are handled formally by the court, which means, or about 1 in 8 that are handled formally by the court. So they're not diverted, they're not dismissed. Those kids are ordered to residential placement. Even though that number is pretty low, a recent study by the Council of State Governments of 3 states found that about a quarter of kids with cases end up in placement eventually, often through violations of probation. So about 500,000 kids going through the system every year, about 32,000 locked up on a given day, and many more sort of pulled in through probation and things like that. And in this graphic, this is sort of the main graphic from our report. It gives you a sense of sort of the range of facilities that kids are held in. And it also gives you a sense of offense type. So what are they being held for? You can see that like the adult system, it's really fragmented. You've got people who are held in what are essentially jails, detention centers. You've got kids who are held in what are essentially youth prisons, which are those long-term secure facilities. But you also have a range of other things like wilderness camps and shelters and treatment centers and group homes. So it looks a little different than the adult criminal legal system, but they have a lot in common. That's all I really need to talk about with that slide. Thank you. So I wanted to just do a little bit of intro about the basics of the juvenile justice system. So talking broadly for a minute about sort of how these two systems differ. The report does a lot of compare and contrast, and we'll talk about why, but it's important to understand that they are actually different. So the main difference is the underlying philosophy. Because children and youth are fundamentally different from adults in terms of brain development, among other things, they are not considered fully culpable for law-breaking or delinquent behavior the way that adults are. The juvenile system assumes that youth can change and that its role is to sort of guide that change. So its orientation tends towards interventions that guide youth away from unwanted behaviors. The adult system, in contrast, has a much more punitive orientation. Its primary purpose is to punish people And then incapacitation, sort of getting people off the streets, deterrence, and rehabilitation, those are all secondary purposes. And the underlying philosophy in the criminal legal system that we all know is that law-breaking behavior reflects individual failures. And sort of second chances are privileges to be earned if they're afforded at all. So there are very different perspectives that undergird these two systems. They also differ in terms of processes and types of sentences or interventions and outcomes. Juvenile processes are often much more informal. So they may just be a sort of some counseling from a judge or from a prosecutor or something about sort of don't do it again. They also tend to be more temporary, so you don't end up with this sort of permanent criminal record. They also tend to be private. So the way that adult trials and information is all very public, that's not true for youth, which helps them avoid a lot of the stigmatization and collateral consequences that we see in the adult system. The juvenile system also tends to consider the whole child, so including their family, their school situation, and takes more of a like caseworker kind of approach. Meanwhile, the adult criminal legal system processes are much more public. They're focused on facts and the evidence related to the crime event more than the individual circumstances. The responses of the system are much less individualized, more severe, and as we know, they typically involve some long-term stigma, collateral consequences, like losing the ability to vote, or like hiring and housing discrimination. So things like that. So overall, the juvenile system takes a much more humanistic approach, I would say. It sees the court's role as helping to develop a law-abiding, productive member of society. And that's a pretty broad generalization, all of this is. But broadly, also like the adult system often sees its role as trying to sort of protect society from threatening individuals. So it uses harsher tactics in attempts to change behavior that it views as much more static. And then this next slide, thank you. The one that you're showing now is perfect. Nope, go back. Even the language is different, and I think that's something that is often a barrier for folks trying to understand, if you know about the criminal legal system and you start reading about the juvenile system, you frequently get very confused very quickly because all the vocabulary is different. So we don't even talk about criminal behavior, we talk about delinquent behavior in the juvenile system. When we talk about sort of what's happening in the court, we're not going to call it a trial, we're going to call it an adjudicatory hearing. The decisions are being adjudicated delinquent if you're found guilty, or what we would call convicted in the adult side of things. Yeah, sentences are called dispositions. Incarceration is called commitment. So there's lots of different kinds of jargon to understand, but essentially we're talking about parallel systems that just sort of have a different ethos and different in all the details. At the bottom of this slide, in case you're interested at all in these language things, there's also a note about the terms waive, direct file, and transfer, and those are all terms that you'll hear when someone is making a decision to try a kid as an adult instead of as a child in the juvenile court. So that's just sort of to give you a sense of how parallel and how different these two things are. So that, I would say, is sort of why these two worlds of juvenile and criminal justice tend to be very siloed. Essentially they are running in parallel, but they overlap very little. They're different courts with different system actors, different facilities, different language. Everything is a little bit different. And even on the reform and advocacy side of things, we find ourselves siloed. So organizations that are working on these issues, like PPI, we tend to focus on one system or the other and not both, even though there's a lot that they have in common. So that's actually part of why we wrote the report that I'm talking about today. Our audiences at PPI tend to focus on the adult criminal legal system, but many of the same moral problems and moral questions that they care about apply to the juvenile side as well. So we wanted to draw their attention to all of those similarities in hopes that they will also support juvenile justice system reforms and see that we're all more or less in the same fight. And by the same token, we wanted to lift up some of the sort of successes that we've seen in the juvenile system, especially there. They've managed to reduce their numbers in confinement far, far more than we have in the adult side. So we want to encourage folks who are focused on criminal justice reforms to draw any lessons that they can from the youth side of things. Talk a little bit more about that in a bit. All right, so we've talked a little bit about differences, but I would submit that at the end of the day, these systems have a lot more in common than they do differences. In particular, the people. They're often dealing with the same communities, same families, and even the same individuals, just at different stages of their lives. So I've the next couple of slides are to kind of give you a sense of that overlap in the populations. Can you go to the next one, please? Thank you. All right, so in this slide, we can see that this is based on adults who are in state prisons. This was a survey that was conducted in 2016. And we can see that 1 in 3 adults in state prison report being arrested for the first time before they even turn 16. So that's a huge number of people who are in prison as adults who have been involved with various justice systems since their youth. And those rates, as you can see, are higher among men than women, and they are highest among Black and Indigenous folks, as well as people reporting 2 or more races. So these are folks who would have been involved in the juvenile system before they ever became involved in the adult criminal legal system, but you can see it's sort of the same group of people being handed off in many cases. Can you go to the next slide, please? Cool. And in this one, this is from the same survey. You can see how frequently adults in prison report adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, sometimes they're called. That includes things like having an incarcerated parent, being in foster care, experiencing homelessness and poverty as a child. You can see that almost 2/3 did not complete high school. That is directly connected to these early experiences of criminalization and also to these adverse experiences. Yeah, as you can see on the far right there, you have that same statistic about arrests before 16, and you have almost 70% arrested before they turn 19. So tons and tons of very early system involvement that contributes to sort of the path to prison for a lot of folks. So I think those statistics help show how system involved individuals, whether they're youth or adult, are disproportionately marginalized in society, often along class, race, educational attainment, sexual orientation, disability, along all of those lines. In particular, we see similar racial disparities. We see Black people are much more overrepresented compared to their portion of the total population, and white people underrepresented. That's something we see in both systems. So again, same kind of like slice of society that we are seeing in both systems. I think this slide also gets to the fact that many people, we know many people come to jail and prison with a history of trauma, and that starts really early. And the involvement with the system as a child often introduces more trauma. So this is all, if you can picture this as sort of the story of someone's life, they're being involved early, they're going through some really difficult traumatic experiences that also involve the criminal legal system's involvement. And then they end up trapped in these cycles. A final note on the people similarity between these two groups is that, like the adult population, kids in the juvenile system, there's a huge amount of overlap between victims and perpetrators. So the kids who are involved in the juvenile system very often have been victims of law-breaking behavior just as much as they've been perpetrators. Very often those victims and perpetrators have connections, have social relationships, whether they're family or friends or siblings or neighbors. So the punishment of the perpetrator often causes strain and harm for victims as well. And that's something I know that we all see in the adult context as well. Ooh, need a little water. Okay, so besides people, I would say these two different systems share a lot in terms of conditions of confinement. I think we all have an idea that the juvenile system is sort of kinder, gentler system, and in some ways it is, but the experience of confinement is really hard in both systems. Sorry, just looking at comments. Some of the things that have in common in terms of conditions, these youth are largely held, almost exclusively held in locked facilities and places that use mechanical restraints, talking about handcuffs, leg cuffs, restraint chairs, straitjackets. They often isolate youth in locked rooms for hours on end. Many kids are held in facilities that hold large numbers of youth, so over 200 kids. These are those old facilities you may have heard about. So, they've got the razor wire and use chemical restraints and things like that, these sort of youth prisons. The number of those facilities has shrunk a lot. A lot of them have closed up, and only 42 remain as of 2022, but there are still thousands of kids who are held in them. Some of these sentences or not sentences, but periods of confinement are also fairly long-term. About a quarter of kids are held over 6 months, and about 10% are held for more than a year. That's nothing, of course, compared to some adult sentences, but in the context of a child's life, that's a significant amount of time and also represents a major disruption in their family and social and educational lives. So, yes. And then finally, a lot of the same abuse and neglect that we see in adult facilities also happens in youth confinement. So sexual victimization, staff assaults, sleep deprivation, leaving the lights on all night, and then a shortage and mismatch of services to meet kids' needs. So that's something I can talk more about in a bit. I'm gonna try and move it along a little bit. Yeah, racial disparities. We touched on this a little bit, but no conversation about either of these systems is complete without talking about the stubborn racial disparities that we see. In the juvenile system, those disparities are most pronounced among Black children, but Indigenous youth are also overrepresented. So in terms of for Black youth, we've got, they make up 14% of the overall youth population, but almost half of boys who are confined are Black and about 40% of girls. And in terms of Indigenous youth, they make up a very small, less than 1% portion of the overall youth population, but they have twice that or 3 times as much representation in the confined population. So it's small in number, but in terms of proportion, we see a lot of racial disproportionality. In terms of, sorry, my dog is making noises. So the disparities, often the question is sort of, where does this come from? And I think it's important to clarify that these aren't necessarily kids who are having lots of different, we're not seeing behavior differences across these groups, but we're seeing different decisions made by juvenile justice system actors. So starting with policing, right? Kids of all races report similar patterns of offending when it comes to having weapons, alcohol and drug use, fighting, but it's the Black and brown kids who come into contact with police more and are more often arrested. So that is sort of the start of the disparities. Then at the sort of prosecution level, again, like you see with adults, Black children tend to be charged with more charges, more serious charges compared to white youth. They also, Black youth and Indigenous youth are more likely to be, their cases are more likely to be processed formally. So that means going through the whole court process and not just being quickly diverted or dismissed. And some of this, some folks have said, is potentially related to what they call adultification, which is when a child is perceived as older, more culpable, more responsible than their peers, which in turn leads to harsher consequences. In particular, we see this with girls who are often sort of seen as being more mature, which might explain why we see confined girls sort of skew younger than confined boys. So we've got like almost half of girls who are in confinement are under 16 versus only about 30% of boys. So we're seeing sort of girls locked up younger, potentially because they're seen as, they should know better earlier. And then finally, in terms of disparities, decisions to transfer youth, so to try them as adults instead of as kids, those are also subject to racial disparities. So Black youth make up less than 40% of all delinquency cases, but they make up almost 60% of those tried as adults. And the opposite's true for white kids, who make up more than 40% of cases, but just a quarter of kids who are tried as adults. So we see this all the way down, that these decision-making points all kind of like accumulate levels of disparity. So it just kind of snowballs as it goes. So yeah.
So Wendy, let me
Please.
ask you a question based on some of the chat comments. It's interesting how so much of this tracks with the adult population and the disparities. I'm wondering, as ministers, do you have any recommendations for someone working with juveniles in terms of how a ministerial approach that might be different with them than it would be for people who are ministering to incarcerated adults?
Well, I am not someone who ministers, so I don't know exactly what all it entails. But I would think a lot of those same lessons are going to, or a lot of the same strategies I would think would carry across. Like I said, I think there's more that they have in common than they have different. But with youth, I think like the whole system sort of writ large, keeping in mind that like these are developing minds, they are changing rapidly, having just like one trusted adult can make a huge difference for kids. So I think there's a lot, maybe more potential for sort of like mentorship or relationships to have a lasting impact, even on a short-term kind of relationship. But again, I'm not a minister, so I can't speak to that too much. But I do think that there's a lot of truth to the sort of kids are different, kids change rapidly.
Yeah, and I would invite any of our participants attending today, if you want to write in the chat, if you have experience working with juveniles, how do you go about your work? What do you focus on primarily? Somebody else asked here, they're saying, I'm helping a family whose son was sent to state prison recently. He's 16. He was 13 when the incident happened. They're interested in hearing your personal experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. So my family members they were not incarcerated, certainly not in an adult facility. I have two nephews who were arrested for very different kinds of things. One of whom was processed formally and was subject to probation for a year and some change. And ultimately, because he complied with the terms of his probation, you know, he doesn't have this sort of like lingering record, and there's no, you know, he's not going to get revoked and get sent to jail or anything the way that they would in an adult setting, which is good. But yeah, it was a pretty intense court process and year of supervision for him. It looked a lot like adult probation to me, which was interesting. And then my other nephew, because he was dealing with autism and things of that nature, he ended up being treated informally. So this kind of gets back to that treating the whole child thing and individualizing responses. And he ended up sort of, the result of all of that was that he was sent to a clinical day school, so sent to a school where he could get treatment and learn life skills and things like that. And I think that was actually a really appropriate outcome for him and helped a lot, which is, I have to say, like something I have not seen a lot in the adult system. I have not seen a lot of folks say, yeah, that really helped. but I think that there are, because of the orientation towards, you know, trying to help these kids sort of figure out their path, I think there is potential for a lot of good impact there.
And what is the percentage of juveniles who end up in adult facilities?
It's quite small. It's shrank a lot. I think currently it's about 2,000 kids, if I'm remembering correctly, who are in adult facilities. That number has come way down. But it is still 2,000 kids on a given day. I mean, that's too many kids.
Okay. And I know in California in recent years, there was a move toward resentencing people who were sentenced as adults for crimes they committed while they were juveniles. Do you have any data on that? Like what's going on nationally in those moves toward?
Sure. Well, there were some sort of Supreme Court decisions that said essentially you can't sort of automatically sentence juveniles to life without parole. So those cases are all generally being resentenced, and states are passing their own laws and changing their sentencing schemes. I don't know the numbers exactly, but I know that like a lot of folks have been released from, you know, through those resentencing processes. And yeah, and the sentences themselves are changing. So we have fewer kids who are getting those extreme sentences. I could look those up if anyone has questions. I can find them later.
Well, to go back briefly to the earlier comment about ministerial approaches, Don writes here that in my 13 years experience ministering at a youth prison, ages 14 to 24, youth have, I just lost it.
I see this, they're reading
See
about.
that? Okay, yeah, all right. So the youth have a very low level of reading ability. They're often on the ADHD spectrum, and they don't read a lot. They're typically unchurched and explore multiple religions. They need someone who will listen to them, walk with them, and not give up on them.
Actually, in the mention of sort of ADHD spectrum, a ton of neurodivergent kids get caught up in this system, which is probably unsurprising. Like, you know, we see police sort of misresponding to like mental health problems all the time, disabilities all the time, and also neurodivergence, especially with kids. You know, people don't really know how to respond, and you know, the tool we have is this system. That's how they're going to respond. And so you do see disproportionate numbers of kids with autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, learning disabilities in the juvenile system, and particularly those of color. And yeah, and their needs are not being met very well by the system, I would say, typically, at least if they end up in confinement, I should say. You know, if they can be diverted out to other services that are community-based, that might go well, but they don't fare very well in confinement. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those comments from our participants.
I'm happy to get back there. I'm noting that I'm running longer than I thought, so I'm gonna try and speed her up a little bit. I think I was talking, yeah, okay. we were talking about sort of similarities. So I think the last big similarity between these two systems that I wanted to point to is just there's a lot of unnecessary incarceration, and that's of course something we see in both systems. In particular, we see pretrial detention, so folks that aren't yet convicted or sentenced who are being confined anyway. That is something that also happens in the juvenile context. And I want to say it's almost half of youth that are confined have not yet sort of been sentenced to anything. They've not been committed. They're just kind of waiting. So they are experiencing all of the harms of confinement without actually having that culpability at that point. Excuse me. So I would assume folks would be interested in sort of like why they're being locked up if pretrial, and over half are accused of person offenses, so what we would call violent offenses in the adult context. But just as in the adult system, like person offenses encompasses a really wide range of behaviors, and not all of them result in serious harm. It might be simple assault or fighting or something. So oftentimes, like, it is a pretty extreme response to what is kind of typical adolescent behavior. I've also heard that, again, this is similar to the adult system, that sometimes folks refer kids to juvenile courts to try and access them, try and get them services, because they can't access them in the community. And they think, well, if they're involved with the court will certainly connect them. But actually, we see that there aren't as many resources available to the juvenile system as you might think. And they don't do a great job of meeting all those needs. So I would certainly not encourage folks to use that strategy. And then other kinds of unnecessary detention besides the pretrial is that they're locking up a lot of kids for minor offenses. So for status offenses, which are things that aren't law breaking for adults, but are for people who are under 18. So it'd be like, liquor laws, things like that, like, or even breaking curfew or running away or truancy at school, like all those things would be considered status offenses. And they are locking kids up for that. The other thing that we see a lot is technical violations of their parole or probation. So this is like, again, your community supervision might come with conditions like a curfew or having to attend a certain program or something like that. And if you miss something, or maybe you've got a probation fee, you miss your payment, all of those things that can be considered technical violations. So you haven't committed any crime, but you've run afoul of one of these rules. And that's how a lot of kids end up in confinement. So there's about 4,000 kids on a given day who are locked up for those kinds of reasons. All right, so to try and get to the sort of lessons piece of this, first I just kind of want to summarize some of the big problems in the juvenile system. So we've got criminalization of youthful behavior, I'll call it, and particularly of certain kids or certain communities. So just as we see in the adult system, you see sort of what's the phrase, to a hammer everything's a nail, something along those lines, right? That not every social problem needs to be dealt with through these processes. So arguably there are much better ways to be dealing with some of these problems. But the resources that we have, public resources, are funneled towards these punitive systems, and not sort of community-wide investments. We also have disparities, racial disparities and other kinds of disparities that kick in at this front end of the system, and then they accumulate over time and make and sort of contribute to the disparities we see in the adult system and later parts of the system, because these things are cumulative, right? If you have a record, you're going to be treated more harshly in subsequent steps. And there are even some policies where once you're tried as an adult, you're always tried as an adult. no matter what your sort of next offense is. So that's another way that people get sort of sucked into deeper and deeper levels of involvement. Another big problem is sort of the resources and responses don't match the needs of the kids. So even though this is a system that's attempting to intervene and sort of help kids, it often ends up punishing them and not really fixing much. Again, that CSG study I mentioned earlier, it's really wild. It was based in 3 states, and it found that almost half, like 43% of the kids were assessed as low risk. Most were first-time offenders, and most of them received no services at all. So they're just kind of going through this process and going through the trauma of being involved in this process without actually getting much benefit. If they get any kind of services, they tend to get sort of counseling or case management rather than sort of evidence-based interventions that are shown to reduce the risk of reoffending, like cognitive behavioral therapy and anger management and substance use disorder treatment, things like that. So the study is really showing that the services aren't being prioritized for the higher risk kids who really need them. A ton of kids who are low risk are getting services that they don't need, and overall, none of the kids are getting the right match of services to reduce their risk. So really, it's not a very successful system in terms of solving the problem. And at the same time, it's doing harm, right? Kids they're experiencing abuse and further trauma. They're learning not to trust the police or the courts. They're being separated from loved ones, being separated from school, which often disrupts their education. And it can exacerbate those underlying problems or even temporary problems. And then it leads to even more legal system contact down the road. Those are kind of the negative things. But the positive things that we can draw, I think, again, this orientation or philosophy towards, people can change and the court system can help people move towards positive change, considering the whole person and not just the immediate circumstances of the offense. I think that approach is one that works better than simply sort of locking folks up, and at least causes less harm. The recognition that age plays a role in behavior. We've all, maybe not all, but many of us have heard about the age crime curve, that basically law-breaking behavior peaks when you're in your late adolescence, early 20s, and then it drops right off. So people are really low risk later in life. There's not really any need for us to have elderly people locked up, for example. And that's something that the juvenile system seems to understand. It's core to the whole philosophy, but somehow we lose sight of that in the adult system. And if we can show the 5th slide, the line chart. I don't know if someone's still paying attention to that. As I was saying earlier, the juvenile system has decarcerated really successfully compared to the adult system. So policymakers have responded pretty rationally to falling crime rates, evidence of what works, and sort of like seeing, and they've responded to the public pressure that like, oh, there's these abuses happening, like this is terrible, we shouldn't be treating people like this. That has worked really well in the juvenile context. In terms of reform and advocacy, it has worked less well in the adult context. So they've shrunk the confined population by more than 70% since 2000, which would be an amazing amount for the adult system. So I think there are some sort of lessons for us in terms of the messaging and the framing and the use of facts to sort of shape policy in the adult side. And then there's a lot of strategies we can look at in terms of like closing and repurposing prisons, redirecting resources to community-based services and treatment, smaller, more rehabilitative facilities themselves. Also, they tend to not carve out or exclude people from programs and services the same way. So juvenile system folks have pushed for no reject policies in a lot of sort of areas where you couldn't in the adult context, politically speaking. So I'm talking about like violence reduction programs that happen in the home or in the community and not inside. Changing laws to make things non-jailable. And then lots of earlier system diversion, something that works really well in the juvenile system and is pretty rare, like pre-arrest diversion is pretty rare. On the adult side of things, capping sentences, shifting funds, trauma-informed care, all of these things are sort of strategies that have been applied in the juvenile context and would probably be very beneficial for the adult system. So I'm going to stop there because I know I've been talking a long time, and I will let y'all ask any more questions or move on.
Well, thanks so much, Wendy. You know, this data is really important for us as ministers to understand the context of what we're working in, and hopefully spurs people to think about approaches they might take in whatever given situation they find themselves in. But I wanted to bring up a comment that Bob raised, and I can find it here. He said, did your study find any difference in the quantity and or quality of programs of juvenile or adult incarceration? He has mostly adult ministry experience, but with the different developmental stages, there's different levels of experience and needs. Can you want to address that?
Yeah, I think I can't speak too much to it. There's less that we know about sort of quality and quantity of programs actually in both systems. Data-wise, that's hard to suss out from sort of the numbers that the government publishes. But we do, I think I talked a little bit about the CSG study that really is all about the mismatch of services and programs to kids' needs. And they do talk about dosage, so how frequently kids are getting services and what kinds of services they're getting, whether they're risk reduction or whether they're strengths-based or job training kind of things. My sense is that in the juvenile system, there's a lot more attention to evidence-based practices. And I think in the adult system, we tend to see a lot of sort of volunteer run, often, or things that have just been in place for years and years and years, and they do it because they've been doing it. I don't know how much sort of focus is on the evidence-based programming, and also just the resources that are available for programming are way, way, way too few, as you probably have experienced.
Do you have any data as to how many of the juvenile detention facilities are state-run versus privately contracted?
There is data on that. Let me see if I put it in the report. Okay, so actually, yes. So far more kids proportionally are held in private facilities than in the adult system. In the adult system, I want to say it's about 8% of adults are held in privately operated facilities. In the adult context, it tends to be very, very public systems. But for kids, it's about 1 in 5, especially some of the smaller places, so the shelters, group homes, residential treatment facilities, those tend to all be private. And weirdly also tend to hold more girls than boys proportionally, which is strange.
Oh, okay. Any thoughts about the difference, say, gender in terms of ministerial approach, working with boys versus working with girls?
Boy, I wish I was a psychologist. I feel like I would have a lot more to say on that front, but I think that I think the need to be gender responsive and trauma informed is very, very important in the sort of women's incarceration context, and particularly with girls, I would think. I know that like there in general, because there's so many fewer girls and women who are confined than boys and men, they tend to sort of get what the guys get, just scaled way down and with fewer resources. And particularly during like adolescence, I think the need to be more sort of tailored to what girls are going through versus boys. I think that's probably much greater. I don't know how that plays out in real time, but I would be worried about that in your shoes.
Yeah. Interesting question here. Can you speak to your decision to label your report youth confinement rather than juvenile detention? Was there a conscious
Yeah,
choice there?
there's a lot of language stuff that we think a lot about that probably other people don't think about so much, but internally matters to us. So part of it is that detention is, I'll talk about confinement versus detention first. So detention is sort of a term of art that means you haven't yet been sentenced to confinement. So confinement is more of an umbrella term that can include people who are detained, sort of pretrial, and people who are incarcerated, that is sentenced. So confinement kind of encompasses all of that. And then for the youth versus juvenile piece, that is where we kind of depart from the terms of art because the system itself does use the word juvenile. We, as an advocacy organization, we try not to use sort of dehumanizing terms, and juvenile is one of those terms that kind of only has this legal system connotation, right? We don't talk about kids as juveniles in any other context. So to refer to kids as juveniles is in a way kind of suggesting that they are criminal. And so we try and avoid those kinds of stigmatizing terms and refer to them as what they are, which is kids and youth and children.
Right. Thank you. Now, do you can we put up a slide, or do you have your contact information so people who might want to pursue a conversation with you
do that, but I can put it in the
in the chat feature? Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine.
Yeah, if folks have follow-up questions or anything, I'd be very happy to answer them. It's just wsawyer@prisonpolicy.org. And yeah, that's the best way to reach me for sure. Happy to answer questions. I know there was a big info dump for y'all. Oh, I see another question.
Okay, one last question that we have time for, and that is something I was wondering about too, is
Oh boy.
with ICE and detention, do you know what are the differences now with youth detention and the immigration system?
It's a great question. I was talking about this with my colleagues this morning. It's sort of like where do we draw that line between criminal legal system stuff and immigration system stuff? Because obviously immigration is largely being criminalized now, so we're seeing a lot of blurred lines there. I will say that the immigration detention system is separate from the juvenile detention system. So they're in different facilities by and large. DHS has its own facilities, and they are often in really abysmal conditions. The kids who are held in those facilities. And we also didn't include in our pie chart the unaccompanied minors, which is several thousand more kids who essentially are being confined, held by Office of Refugee Resettlement. They're being held until they can be placed with sponsors, etc. But they also have a lot of, there is some overlap, right? Because anything that they do while they're in those settings can be used in their immigration cases. So there's definitely some overlap between the systems that doesn't get discussed much.
Well, thank you. And certainly people can continue the conversation by contacting you. Appreciate the work you're doing and the information you've shared with us today. It's always great to talk to a fellow Husky from Northeast.